The goal is to get a child into a loving home, and we're getting children into shelters after they've been in the hospital. So is that every case? No, but that's how bad it is right now. That thankfully, places like Providence will hold people, even when they don't have any need to be there. But God, then they end up in a shelter? That's what happens when you don't have enough foster families. And we can go through the blueprint on how you have enough foster families. Our policymakers, our agency people have to be willing to do it. It's really a little mind-boggling to me that we passed the legislation to fix this, and it has not been implemented.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today on the show, we have two guests, Amanda Metivier and Les Gara. Amanda is the director of the Alaska Child Welfare Academy at UAA and is a board member and co-founder of Facing Foster Care in Alaska. She and her husband are foster parents who have provided homes for many youth over the past 15 years. Many of those were teenagers, since both Amanda and her husband were foster youth themselves and know the difficulty that older children face in finding a willing home. Les Gara was the 2022 Democratic candidate for governor of Alaska. He is a former legislator who served in the Alaska State House from 2003 to 2019. And throughout his time in the legislature, he advocated for foster care reform, and in 2018 achieved that reform with House Bill 151. In spite of that landmark legislation, little has changed about our foster system. Alaska still faces a severe shortage of not only licensed foster care parents, but also, and just as consequentially, case managers at the Office of Children's Services, commonly referred to as OCS. Lack of case managers means that the case managers we do have are burdened with too many cases, which leads to overwork and burnout. Too few foster parents means that we have some kids who on the worst days of their lives can get stuck sleeping on office floors or living in shelters. If you are curious about becoming a foster parent, I have dropped a link to Alaska's foster care page in the show notes. You can find answers to common questions and how to apply. Amanda Metivier and Les Gara, welcome to the podcast. Amanda, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Amanda Metivier. I'm the director of the Alaska Child Welfare Academy at UAA, and I'm a board member and co-founder of Facing Foster Care in Alaska, and also have lived experience in the system as a former foster youth, foster parent, adoptive parent, relative caregiver, lots of experience in child welfare.
And do you mind telling us a little bit about your backstory just to get started?
Yeah, I was in foster care in Anchorage for 3 years before I aged out of the system and was really fortunate to have one foster home. It was a family friend who got licensed for my sister and myself. And so I stayed in that home during my time in care for 3 years and aged out. This was prior to extended foster care in our state, and remained with that family for another 2 years and started college and went on to get undergrad and graduate degree in social work. And I'm still really connected to that family. And then I was out of foster care maybe for only about 2 years before I became licensed to be a foster parent. And my husband.
So how old were you when you got your first?
I was 22 when I had my first foster youth come to live with me, and she was 17 at the time. And my husband's also a former foster youth. Initially, it was a young person I met through Facing Foster Care in Alaska who she had moved over 20 times. And I had just gotten to know her. I mentored her and was giving her rides and just helping her out. And my husband was working at the youth shelter at Covenant House at the time in downtown Anchorage. And she was on a sort of trial home visit to go home with her parent, and that didn't work out. And there was a big team meeting at OCS to try to figure out what to do next. And so we came to this team meeting to be a part of the plan. And there's 15 people in the room going around the table trying to figure out what the plan was. There were no homes still back then. And so they were going to put her back at the shelter for her senior year of high school. And we were like, can we just take her home? So we got an emergency license, and she stayed with us for 3 years and made her way out on her own, and is actually a foster adoptive parent as well. And we just, at a really young age, by the time she left, I think I was 26, and we were like empty nesting and decided we wanted to do it again. And so we just continued to take older youth who typically are harder to place. It's a lot of people don't want teenagers for lots of stigma and other reasons. For us, we thought it was really great because they can learn to drive and they can cook. And it's really about just teaching them life skills and helping them like navigate life and whatever the next step may be. And over 15 years, we fostered 21 youth and have adopted some. And just this last year took guardianship of my nephew. And so it's been a journey. And I keep saying we keep trying to quit. We've closed our foster care license a few times. And then you get this call and you hear the story on the other side of that, but also to know what that experience is like and to know what it's like to really not know what's going to happen next. I think our hearts just pour into it and we continue to say yes. And I'm guessing we'll continue to say yes.
So thankful for the work that you do. I know a little bit about the story of you getting guardianship of your nephew.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll come up in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to put a pin in that.
Yeah.
And then our other guest, Les Gara, I think most of our listeners know who you are. But if you would like to introduce yourself in reference to our conversation today.
Sure. Les Gara served in the legislature and focused on a number of things, but one of the things I focused on was foster care reform. We've had a long-term crisis in the foster care system, and with Amanda's help and her group facing foster care in Alaska, we have made great strides. We've added college scholarships for foster youth. We've added job training scholarships for foster youth. We've started a laptop drive to get laptops for foster youth. Early on, I thought, oh, it's computers, and then computers don't really work for a kid who has 48 placements. That's why you do a laptop. We want to do something better than just give kids clothes. We want to make sure that every child in the state has an equal opportunity to succeed, whether you're born rich or poor, in foster care, outside of foster care, with decent parents or parents who struggle. And I took on foster care as a cause, not because I grew up in foster care, but because I knew I could make a difference, that people trusted me. They knew I had experience. They knew that there was this big problem out there. And so, with Amanda's help and the help of many people in the community and youth and alumni at Facing Foster Care, other foster youth, we worked on all of the sort of state-of-the-art science and evidence-based solutions we could to make sure children had a chance in the world, culminating in 2018 with the biggest foster care reform in state history, which I have mixed feelings. I don't want to be in the legislature anymore. I did my time, as I tell people that, but I do want somebody to be there to make sure it gets implemented. And right now it has not been. And I'm not blaming anybody, but it hasn't been. And so the blueprint is there to help foster youth succeed, to reduce the number of youth in foster care, to make sure that children get reunited with their families as quickly as appropriately, or adopted out of the system if that's not possible, as quickly as possible. Because the longer you leave them in the system, the more you traumatize them. We came up with a state-of-the-art solution, not on our own, by looking at what other states did that worked. And through a very skeptical legislature, as a Democrat, when the legislature is a Democrat, sometimes Republicans don't want to listen to you. As a Republican, sometimes Democrats don't want to listen to you, but we got everybody to listen. And so in a place that is sometimes partisan, when this bill went to the Senate for a vote, a very rare thing happened. And that is that people were so moved by this solution, and it's comprehensive, that not only did it pass unanimously in a Republican Senate that was 15 Republicans and 5 Democrats, not only did it pass unanimously across party lines, but every person stood up one by one to ask to be a co-sponsor of the bill, a cross-sponsor of the bill. I don't know if that's ever happened in Senate history, and if it has happened, it's only been 1 or 2 or 3 times. This was a priority of the legislature in 2018, and it's a priority of the public, and that's the message I'd like to send to newer legislators and the folks at OCS now with so much turnover who weren't there years ago. Is the solution is sitting there. The question is whether it's ever going to be implemented, and that's been the frustrating part.
I want to talk exactly about what HB 151 did, but before that, can you just share a little bit about your personal experience with the foster system?
Sure. My parents were in arranged marriage. They were immigrants. And in their tradition, you had a lot of arranged marriages. And the result of that arranged marriage was they didn't like each other from day one. So when I was 3...
Where were they immigrants from?
They grew up in Baghdad. They were Iraqi Jews, immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. And when they had me, they weren't getting along. My mother took me from the house, my father, my brother, and my sister. She thought it was the right thing to do, even though it probably wasn't. And we lived on the run for about 3 years, from age 3 to age 6. Then my father got custody when I was 6. As a little kid, all I wanted to do was live with my brother and sister, right? It just seemed more stable. And so I was happy about that. Moved in the summer when I was 6 in the Bronx in New York. But by December, somebody came into my father's office. He had a doctor's office in Harlem. He was really well loved in that area. We found out since.
He was a doctor?
He was a general practitioner, a family doctor, and he saw people that nobody else would see. And he was the only game in town in the neighborhood. And we've just found out just from people coming up to us that he was really well loved in that area. But somebody came into his office one night and killed him, stabbed him to death. He was working late one night. So I grew up in 2 foster homes. They were fine. That's like I don't have the terrible experience some kids have in Alaska. We know youth, Amanda and I know youth who have been in 20, 30, 48, over 50 foster homes.
Did you get to stay with your brother and sister?
My sister was in college by the time my father was killed. My brother stayed in foster care. He was older than me too for a few years, and then he went off and to City College in New York, which was the free college because he didn't have any money. And then I made it through foster care till 18, and then I went off to college. Yeah.
So I have the data from October 2023. Mm-hmm. OCS says that there's 2,667 children in out-of-home care, mm-hmm. and that 1,860 are Alaska Native.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we have currently 1,270 licensed homes.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily mean that all of those homes have kids in them or how many are in each.
That's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
One of the things that Amanda and I got into the law under a bill called House Bill 27 in 2017. 2016? I'm going to argue with you and say it was 2017. It doesn't matter. Amanda's usually right, so just you can usually take that to the bank. We required, among other things, that bill required that the state, in times of foster parent shortages, actively and affirmatively recruit for foster families. We're not doing that. It's not rocket science. Amanda and I worked together to get money in the budget to advertise in times of shortage. So a number of times we put money in the budget to advertise and say there's a shortage. And when Alaskans hear that there's a need like this, they step up. It worked, and each time we did it. But nobody's done that since. We've tried to contact the state to get them to do it, failed, and when we failed, then Amanda and I went to the city. There was COVID money. We got the city to do a few $100,000 worth of advertising, but it's a state obligation. It's in statute. It says in times of shortage, the state shall work to recruit foster families. Sometimes it doesn't have to cost money. If you're, let's say, the governor or a commissioner and you're in front of 200 people, you could do a by the way with a handout, mm-hmm. and you'll get 2, 3, 4 people to step up. And so it doesn't always have to cost money, but that was the intention of the law. That law is not being followed.
I agree. We need to get the word out there more. As a former foster parent myself, who's adopted from the foster system, replacing Ivy Sponholz in the legislature, who was a foster parent who adopted from the foster system. We have lots of examples of people who did it. What I think and I could be wrong, but I think the impression that folks who've never done it before, never been involved with it before, is that it's going to require an inordinate amount of time, an inordinate amount of money. It's going to be an enormous headache, extraordinarily stressful, that they're too old, too poor, they can come up with a million excuses of why this isn't the right fit for them. Mm-hmm. And I can't say that every situation is going to be super easy, but I just think that there is a misperception in the public that you have to meet a stringent criteria to be able to do this, that you have to have a very large home, that you have to have, that you have to have a lot of free time. And I think that I wish there was a way to combat some of those stereotypes so that more folks would give it a chance.
Yeah. And I think to your point before, you don't have to be rich. You don't have to be married. You don't have to be a 2-parent household, right? Families look a lot of different ways. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for people to sign up to be a foster parent and to help, but to also know that what that means is if you take one child, they may have siblings somewhere that want to come along with them, right? Or if you take a child in who's moved multiple times or has experienced complex trauma, there will be training and support to understand what that means for that child. But I think when you take on a child, you also take on their family. And I've had, as a foster parent, a lot of really good relationships with parents who in many ways have been my greatest resource, especially in taking teens who, as we know, are in a phase of life where they want to really exert their autonomy and want to be independent and want to take risks. And a system of child protection is not built to allow for that. but oftentimes who respect and love their parents. And so if you call up the parent, the mother of the young person and say, hey, your child's skipping school, can you help me out? Oftentimes they're happy to be asked and want to be a part of that. And I think it's a lot bigger too than just one child or one sibling group. It's understanding you're standing in the gap for a parent who maybe can't do it for a period of time, or you're going to connect with this child, potentially be a permanent option. But it's still important to maintain those relationships across the board. But again, yes, with a lack of and a shortage of resource families and foster parents all over, yeah, it becomes a bigger burden on families who don't want to say no. But it may mean when you get that call, you're saying yes to a child not sleeping in an office for the next 2 weeks, or sleeping in a shelter, or sleeping in a hotel. Right now, the state contracts with a security company when there aren't enough foster homes, and these security guards, who may be off-duty police officer who works around the clock and will stay in a hotel with a child. And there are children in offices right now, sleeping in offices across the state. And I think for people who want to come into this, it's knowing like what you're capable of and what your boundary is, and being realistic about that, but also saying, hey, I could be temporary potentially for 2 weeks until you do find the right fit, right? Or knowing you're signing up to foster. And maybe that does mean supporting visitation with biological families, so those children can go back home as the parents start to exhibit behavior change or sobriety. And so I think it's oftentimes a lot more complex, but in some ways simpler than we think, because child protection and child welfare systems don't work unless we have a community that's functional and works, right? And so we know majority of children come into care because of substance abuse, and not just substance abuse, but neglect, unsafe circumstances. Because of that, our state should really be investing in support for substance abuse and substance use services across the state. Or if we know childcare is an issue, right? Foster families need a place for children to go during the day, especially small children, if they work. We need people to plow our roads, right? So we could transport children around, go to work, and be functional. But there's lots of things that child welfare systems can't do unless the community is functional. And oftentimes I think Alaskans, when they hear a need, will step up and do it. But it could be temporary. It could be long-term. It could be for a weekend. It could be for 2 weeks. It could be for 2 years. This looks a lot of different ways. And I think for people to come into it and know what they're capable of, and then holding that boundary to say, I'm here to help, but I can only take one child, or I can only take two children, or for just this period of time.
So two things. Number one, I heard you talking about upstream investments. And I think that's important for people to understand that in my case, my child was removed from a home because of neglect, drug addicted parents who were not providing care to the child. And I think that, again, just like giving people a frame of reference, because I think you have this idea of what is a child that's removed from the home and what is that home that they were removed from. And it often, that's a terrible situation, but it may not be the dramatic one that you have in your head. And finding a way, so we have two ways of looking at this. Do we not have enough foster parents, or is there a way for us to have less foster children? There's two ways to attack that issue. And if there were some way to do an intervention with parents with substance or alcohol issues so that they can get the help that they need, so that they aren't neglecting their children.
These are all good thoughts, and these are all written specifically into the last piece of foster care reform that we passed. So the solution is on paper. The question is whether the solution will be implemented. So just so people's eyes don't glaze over, this is not just, it's foster care again. This is a crisis right now. We lost roughly a third of our foster parents' licensed foster homes during COVID. That happened nationally. It's not this governor's fault. It's not the OCS's fault. It happened nationally because people were, for a while, were wary about having somebody in their home. But other states have built back their foster families. We have not. And it's not just a third of the families that we lost, so that we don't have enough foster homes for foster youth. But among those licensed homes, which we say, that must be a home, a large portion of those licensed homes don't take in any youth. So you haven't just lost a third of your families. You also have licensed homes who won't take in any youth. OCS doesn't keep track of that number of homes. That's probably another third. So probably down roughly half of our foster families from where we were before COVID. And just so people see this the way it really is, Amanda and I know of a young woman, and these are the kinds of examples that are the worst. But this is where we are in what is a crisis. It's not just, a subject that we should talk about. We know of a young woman, a teenager, who was at Providence Hospital. And Providence does this all the time now. They hold patients after they're medically able to be released. This young woman, teenager, was ready to be released. She had no reason to be at Providence, but there was no foster home for her to go to. And so OCS asked Providence to hold the child there in a hospital when she didn't need to be in a hospital with nobody that she knew. And she remained in that hospital until they said, we can't find a family. And she was sent to a youth shelter. And that's not acceptable. That's the system we have. We have kids sitting in hospitals who are then not given a loving home.
For our listeners, I'm going to drop a link to the House Bill 151 summary into the show notes so that people can see exactly the legislation that Les Gara got passed and the reforms that were supposed to be enacted, which, if I want to give the benefit of the doubt, there are huge problems, in part because of coming out of COVID and some of the issues that happened during COVID that made these reforms difficult to implement, but also they need to be implemented. We need to find a way to make what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, I don't think we can talk about this without talking about challenges around workforce and frontline caseworkers and challenges with both hiring and turnover. The beauty of House Bill 151 is that it was meant to combat turnover. So we know that for every child in foster care with each new caseworker, that extends the timeline for how long they're going to be in custody and how long it is before they go home or move into a guardianship or become adopted. It creates for more placement disruptions because resource families or relative care providers are not supported. And so it creates all these other challenges. And so 151 was really meant to create additional positions to drive down caseloads. And one of the challenges, both prior to COVID and has been exacerbated by COVID, is with finding people to do the job, because it's not easy work. And it's not just an OCS issue. It's an all state positions issue in Alaska and across the country. But we're seeing a direct impact to families now when it's become more difficult to hire. The system has moved to a system of competency-based hiring. But the state has also not stepped up, right, to say we're going to offer more pay or a higher rate of compensation for people who do this work, who really are first responders, right? They're responding to very complex trauma, working around the clock in the middle of the night to assess for child safety and make very difficult decisions. And to do that work without a college degree, with minimal work experience in social services, and for $26 an hour is not realistic. And it's a detriment to children and families everywhere.
Right now, over half of our caseworkers quit their jobs within a year. They go in, they're told that they're not going to have many cases, and they end up with twice as many cases as they can handle. And they burn out. And they say, for $26 an hour, I know of people who've said, I'll go work at Subway. Because that is not a professional wage, $26 an hour. The state had two routes it could have taken in implementing this bill to lower caseloads. And you want to lower caseloads because if your social workers are burning out constantly, then you don't have a caseworker who knows the child, knows the family, can get that child out of foster care as quick as possible. You get a new caseworker who goes, hey, my name is so-and-so, what's your name? And the foster child goes, I've been here 12 months. And then they get a new caseworker, and it's another 12 months. So the only way to make it work is to get youth out of foster care as quickly as possible. Basically put the foster care system out of business, right? The state had two choices it could have made. And I'm not blaming the state, but the choice it made didn't work, so let's fix it. It could have professionalized the workforce, paid a professional wage, and required job qualifications to do this job where you're deciding whether or not to tear apart a family. This is a very serious decision. Instead of professionalizing the workforce, certainly there are a number of people with degrees who do this work. They said, you don't have to have a degree in social work. You don't even have to have a college degree. And you don't have to have any relevant background in social services. There are people taking these jobs who are 18 years old who worked for a tour company the year before. And they're being paid $26 an hour. So they could have taken the route, which is let's professionalize and pay the workforce, and they decided to deprofessionalize the workforce, make it an entry-level job. It's heartbreaking. When you're 18 years old, you should not be placed with the burden of deciding whether or not to tear apart a family. And that has to be fixed. I get why they did it. You have to find ways to save money. That did not work. So when you try and save money and it doesn't work, you have to go back and say, that didn't work. What do we do? And what you should be doing is professionalizing the workforce. The old standard at OCS used to be you had to have a social work degree or the equivalent in work experience and life experience, the equivalent. That's no longer the standard, because if that were the standard, they would have to raise wages and attract people and pay a professional wage. You have to pay a professional wage to somebody making a decision on what happens to a family.
Mm-hmm. One little example I'll give. When we got our first foster placement, who ended up being our only foster placement, who's still with us years later, you pick him up from the social worker and they help you put the car seat in and they're like, bye. And you drive away. And you think someone will call us, someone will check in with us and let us know what's going to happen, what the next step is. And for us, it was 2 weeks before we heard anything. But what I've learned since then is that that 2 weeks was a very fast timeline, that there are foster parents who pick up a child and don't hear anything for months, don't get contact from the agency saying, they're going to need to have a mommy visit or that sort of stuff. Not because it's such a large amount of workload. There's such a relief once that placement has been made and that kid is safe. And now we can worry about all these crises that are in front of us. But this is a real thing where foster parents are getting their initial foster child and then getting no input for a very long period of time. And that is a direct result of turnover, not having people tracking.
When you don't have enough caseworkers, which we don't, and when caseworkers are leaving on an average of less than 50% every single year, so you get this constant turnover, and you've got caseworkers who have 30 cases instead of 12, which is what they should have. They don't contact the parents, and the parents get frustrated. And a parent will call with a legitimate question, a medical issue, a school issue, and not get a call back. And the parent says, I'm done with this. I can't deal with this. And so that's how you lose your best foster parents, which is exactly the model we have right now, a model that causes you to lose your best foster parents, except for the ones who know I've got to do this and I'll just bite my lip. And bless those families who still do that. But yeah, it's all part of if your caseloads are too big, caseworkers can't do their jobs, they burn out, they leave, they don't return family phone calls, and the kids languish.
I want to bring up the story, and this is from Mother Jones from September, and I am going to drop a link in the show notes so folks can take a look at it. But in September 2023, Mother Jones published a large expose of something that was happening in the foster system nationwide, but they specifically used Alaska as an example. It was in large part framed around the story of Katrina Edwards, who was a foster child that when she was 12 years old, which was about 11 years ago, she told her foster parent that she was having ideas about suicide. And that basically started a long period of time in which she was in and out of at first an acute care psychiatric facility and then a residential psychiatric facility. When we look back on the documents and it's clear that she didn't have a plan to kill herself and that she regretted using those words. But ultimately, she had a 24-day stay, and then she had another 20-something day stay, and then ultimately got admitted to a residential facility where she was going to be let go as soon as an appropriate foster family could be found. One wasn't found. She celebrated her 13th birthday in that residential facility. She celebrated her 14th birthday in that residential facility. 18 months.
Yeah. I'll share. So Trina, and I don't want to tell her story for her. I did adopt her older sister, and Trina came to live with me at different points in time too. Throughout her journey, by the time she got to my house, she had moved, I think, 56 times. And had been separate from her siblings for a long time, too. It's a very large sibling group. And she's sweet and caring and genuine and just has this blooming personality. But one of the things that folks have worked on for a long time is this issue around residential care. And there's legislation right now at the federal level. It's the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act. And it's actually a result of a lot of things that have happened in the way of physical and chemical restraint in facilities. But in Alaska specifically, I know there's been a lot of emphasis on North Star, but in general, legal parties, OCS as a system, the Department of Family and Community Services, people have had this issue on their radar for a long time of what do you do when a young person who maybe does need acute intervention for a short period of time or doesn't and lands in one of these facilities for a whole host of reasons. Maybe a young person is making threats to get out of a foster home that they don't want to be in, because we've seen that too. We've had youth make threats of suicide to be able to leave. So there's been a lot of attention on this. And I know the Court Improvement Program has specifically focused on this, and I've been a part of that effort. And so some of the things that we've done, we actually just this last year in October of 2022 passed a new set of court rules that made their way through the Supreme Court. And one is to appoint an attorney for youth in specific circumstances. There's a mandatory appointment now. It used to be discretionary, where every child in foster care gets a guardian ad litem that represents their best interest. They may or may not get an attorney, or one of 14 states that doesn't require an attorney for children in state custody. One, because we don't have enough lawyers in our state in general. And two, because there's a huge cost to that, right? But so we created this section in the rules that allows for a mandatory appointment. And that is if a youth refuses residential care, refuses psychotropic meds, is on the run, is on runaway status, is pregnant or parenting while in foster care. And so now youth are getting attorneys in these certain circumstances to represent them and may get a hearing. Right now, they get a hearing within 30 days if they're going to go to a facility. So this could potentially bump up the timeline with an attorney. Youth have asked, and it was in legislation previously filed by Rep. Sponholz, to give them a hearing within 72 hours of being placed in a facility. So a judge can decide, hear from the experts, and determine, do they need to be there? Are they a harm to themselves or others? If it's an absolute yes, then certainly they should be there and get the support and care they need. If not, if it's a placement issue, they should move on to a least restrictive environment. And for a lot of years, I mean, there were efforts through Bring the Kids Home with the state and the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. There's efforts underway now to beef up supports and services in the community, but there's still not enough. And it may just be that things are slowly boiling over before they burst because of lack of community services. It's really hard to get children, not just in Anchorage, but across the state, into behavioral health services, whether that's one-on-one therapy, something that's more culturally appropriate, and another challenge with lack of services and funding and practitioners.
There's no middle way. And these private hospitals, I'm just going to point out a couple of facts. They're getting reimbursed $938 per night for these foster kids in their care. So that, and with a kid that doesn't really have a true psychiatric illness, that's a pretty easy patient. So $938 a night.
Rep. Sponholz's 72-hour bill did not pass, right?
It did not
No,
pass. I have that HB 266.
It's a super important idea. Look, without casting any aspersions, look, I don't know the specifics of every case that is involved at North Star, right? But Amanda does a very good job when she brings youth before the legislature. She does a stand-up thing, stand up if. And she's had panels I've seen in the past when she's presented to me and others, which are stand up if you've ever been in North Star. And sometimes almost every single child stands up. These are youth who have been in your office having very normal conversations with you, who are working, some of whom are in college or job training programs. I can't tell you that they were wrongly admitted because I don't know for sure. But boy, my suspicions are that my suspicions just look at what the reality is for a caseworker. Caseworker's overwhelmed. Caseworker has 30 cases. Caseworker can't handle all of those cases. We don't have enough foster homes. Caseworker has made a phone call, can't find a foster home. This child looks depressed, as any child who has lost their parents would be, or has anxiety, as many children would have, or has oppositional, not disorder, but is very oppositional, is not Beaver Cleaver, right? Has gone through a bunch of hard stuff in their life. And maybe the caseworker says, boy, this child does have a psychiatric issue and I can't find a home. And all of a sudden the child ends up in North Star. Am I saying that I know how many times this is happening or that's happening? I'm just saying I understand the pressure. And as long as you don't have enough foster families and you overwork these caseworkers so that they don't know what to do, and you hire people who don't have the experience they need to do the job, and you're paying $26 an hour that tells the worker, go work at Subway, it's an easier job. you're not going to solve the problem.
North Star is the only option in this case. And I talked to one foster mom.
Yeah, and in good faith, a caseworker could say, boy, I think they're the only option.
I talked to one foster mom and about this whole, exactly what we're talking about right now. And she had an interesting perspective because she had a sibling group of 3. She had her biological child and then a sibling group of 3. And one of that sibling group of 3 was extremely violent, was beating up his brother and sister and her child. And she was doing everything she could. She and her husband were doing everything they could to try to control the behavior. But she said at a certain point, it was just too dangerous for everyone in the household to have this child who, however you want to look at it, has been through a lot and is acting out. But there was no way that she could subject her home to what was happening. And so she said, you've got to look at it from the perspective of sometimes they don't want the kid to go to a mental hospital, but there's nowhere else in Alaska that kid's going to get sent. And so we need to find other options. So that's not what's happening.
It's basically the 4 things we've talked about, right? It's overwork for the caseworkers, underpayment of them, deprofessionalizing the standard. That's one. It's not having enough foster parents. And if you had enough foster parents and you had enough caseworkers who could return phone calls to parents, you would have happier foster parents, you would have more. And if the state recruited, Amanda, and I think I said, put in the law, it's a legal requirement that the state advertise. And when there's a shortage of foster parents, the state's not doing that. And if we were doing these, things would be a lot better for these youth, right? I think a lot of people in their defense look at the foster care system, you got a new commissioner, or you got new caseworkers, and it just is overwhelming. And they don't know where to start, maybe, because it's an overwhelming problem. But sadly, Amanda and I worked for years to say, here's the solution. It's on paper. It's in the law. And
it's tricky, because what we're talking about is not having enough foster parents leads to issues that you probably wouldn't have if you had enough foster parents. But unfortunately, what people in the public are seeing are the issues that we have today. And they're like, I don't want to be a part of that system. Why would anyone want to jump in? And so we have a very tight rope to walk right here, which is we want people out there to step up and say, I want to be a foster parent. Because, and Amanda, you could speak to this. It's the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. It's the greatest thing that's ever happened.
I think sometimes the system is so overwhelmed that they can't see the forest through the trees because they're dealing with daily crisis. And I'll give you an example. One of the very simple, non-debatable provisions that Amanda and I put into the foster care reform we passed in 2018, it said, look, we want to lower the burden on caseworkers, and we want to lower the burden on parents and lower the burden on kids all at the same time. And we adopted something called the prudent parent standard. And that said, if a parent can make this decision, then a foster parent can make this decision. You don't have to call OCS to get their permission.
To give Tylenol, for example.
Yeah,
let me give you the example we were thinking of is parent wants to take a child to Disneyland, right? Foster parent does. They would have to call OCS to do that. Why? Why would you have to call OCS to take a child on vacation? And the prudent parents standard says if a parent can make the decision, the foster parent can make the decision. It was so that if a parent decided I'm taking my kid to Hawaii with the rest of my family for Christmas break, they didn't have to get pre-permission from OCS. Because if you require them to get pre-permission, you call OCS, you don't get your phone call back because they're overworked. And then all of a sudden that $400 plane fare is $800, and now it's $1,200, and you still haven't heard back. And now your family is leaving tomorrow when you still haven't heard back. So we said, let's make things easier for everybody, for the frustrated parent so they don't have to make the phone call, for the workers so they don't have to return the phone call, and for the child so they could live a normal life. And 8 months after that provision was passed, it still wasn't being implemented because the folks over at OCS are still running around dealing with daily crisis. Somebody called me and said, I tried to take my kid on vacation. And I said, you're allowed to take your kid on vacation. We passed a law to say you could take your kid on vacation. I was like, OCS won't give me the permission. I keep waiting for a call back. They told me I need their permission. They didn't need their permission, but that they hadn't figured out inside OCS that it was important to implement the law. In
California, I had to have a judge's order to take my child out of state.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and you're right. And that doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
Like that takes
Mm-hmm.
30 days. It took a long time. So I can understand what you're saying.
And
if you want to do it,
your
your
airfare,
airfare. Yeah. And you don't want to purchase a ticket if you're potentially not going to get the judge's order. And so it's a real issue.
It's federally, it's been adopted, the prudent hearing standard, but the federal law can't be enforced by state courts. And so that's why we put it in state law. And I think finally, like it's 2 years, it's 3 years later. I've been out of the legislature for 3 years. I think finally they're following the prudent parent standard. It was done to save them work and to keep parents in the system and to help kids. It was like a easy provision. And even that took forever to get implemented.
So if you were to give advice to me as a new legislator, and you were to say, here's what I think is the biggest problem, and here is a solution. And I guess what I'm saying is I'm in the minority. There's no way. I'm not going to do any omnibus legislation that does like 12 things. What's a little thing that maybe I could do that could address a major issue?
I've got two. I don't know that I...
That's good.
I think one is, again, in speaking to House Bill 151, like the tools are there to beef up the workforce. And again, nothing gets better until there are people to do the job. And so when you have enough people to do the job and the right skill set to do the job, they can do true, meaningful social work. They can engage with families who are having a hard time. They can search for relatives early and family friends early and find the right fit for children to prevent them bouncing all over. But then also they can make better decisions throughout the life of the case, and children can exit more quickly, either to go home because parents have been engaged in the process and are getting support and referrals and services they need, or children maybe going to an adoptive placement or into a guardianship or some other permanent plan more quickly. But nothing gets better until matters of workforce are addressed.
Before you go to number two, this is the perfect place to talk about your nephew, about not enough people not able to do their due diligence. Can you just talk a little bit about what happened with your nephew?
My husband and I took in my nephew this last year, and it was actually a case in another state. So he had initially been involved with the system here and then moved to Arizona. And he had been in and out of Arizona's foster care system for the majority of his life. And so we didn't get a call until he was about 3 and had been involved with the system at that point. And there was lots of back and forth return home. But what happened was we were identified as relatives and then just like swept to the side, not notified of meetings or hearings coming up, minimal information. And we're obviously pretty savvy to the system and started to figure out like, who is every individual on this case? Who's the caseworker? Who's their supervisor? Who's the guardian ad litem? Who's the attorney? Who are the parents' attorneys? Who are the parties? Who are the agencies that are involved with this in terms of services? Who is the foster family? We made contact with this foster family in Arizona and just started really heavy advocating and inserting ourselves, which if we didn't, we would have just been swept off to the side. And we showed up at court hearings. We called into team meetings. As much as possible, we made ourselves present. We would still not be notified of things. And then we would ask, we heard there was a hearing. Why weren't we invited? We've said, we're here. We want to be a part of this. We want to be a support. And so when he was 7, so it took several years of back and forth. And over the course of a year, from the time he turned 6, he moved about 10 times between foster homes and facilities and all over the state, missed school, maybe did 2 weeks of kindergarten, and then landed with this really incredible family. And so then we made contact with this family, and this family thought, oh, we just came out of nowhere. After several years, we were like, we've been involved, and here's how we've been involved. We want to get to know you. And we had been through the process here. We were already licensed. And so there's a cross-state process where systems talk to each other. It's called an interstate compact for placement of children. We passed everything in terms of licensing and interstate compact. And so we were starting to talk about a visit. We were starting to talk about him coming to Alaska to stay with us because it looked like reunification wasn't maybe going to happen. And so Arizona said, oh, don't buy tickets. We'll buy tickets for you to come down. This was last summer of 22. We were like, oh, okay. So we wait, we go back and forth. No answer. Oh, we can't buy these tickets. And we're like, we're coming. Like, we have the means to do this. We were going to do this anyway. And so we scheduled a trip down knowing there was a court hearing coming up. And we purchased a ticket for him to come back with us. not knowing if he was going to be able to come back with us. We had no idea if anything would be approved. And we coordinated everything with this foster family. The caseworker was like minimally involved, knew some dates we were coming, but we rented a place right down the street. They took leave from work. We showed up. We spent every day with them in their home. And they gave us so much information about bedtime routines and food and behavioral health needs and medical care and just all the stuff you would want to know. We immersed ourselves with this family. We were going to the beach with them, spending time at their house, having meals together. But also he got to really see that too, and the relationship there. And it was the day before we were set to leave, there was a hearing, and we showed up to court, and the judge said who was in the room. And I just raised my hand, said, we're here. I know we've been all approved in terms of licensing standards, ICPC, we're relatives. We have a ticket for him to come back tomorrow, and there's nothing to say that he couldn't. And I don't see any other barrier than you saying no. And she said yes, and he got to come back with us.
This is really outside the frame of what we're talking about today, but I want to say there is a movement in the lower 48 in particular in certain states and certain state legislatures to make it easier for foster families to adopt. And I just want to go on the record now as saying that I 100% acknowledge that in as much as possible, kids need to be with their biological families. That I am not somebody who advocates toward removing kids and not finding a way towards reunification. In my son's particular case, it just absolutely was just not possible.
Sure, you try and make it happen.
It was not possible.
And
so
if it can't happen, it can't.
I will say I'm going to drop a link to the New Yorker article from last month, which explores this movement to basically stop reunification. It's a barrier to reunification. And I think it's something for people to be aware of.
And I think, too, in speaking to disproportionality and thinking about the disproportionate number of children and youth in foster care in our states that are Alaska Native or American Indian, IFWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, very clearly outlines that diligent relative search has to be done and has to be ongoing. Legislation passed, too, to say diligent relative search should happen on every case and early and often and throughout the life of a case. And oftentimes a grandmother may be identified, or a neighbor or an aunt or a close family friend who initially may be hesitant to engage with the department, right? For a whole host of reasons, but it doesn't mean you stop asking or stop trying to identify family. And when children are placed with family earlier, they are also more likely to remain with family because these are people who already know and love them, which could be a really great thing too. But if you look at the history of our state and the boarding school era and what that means for Alaska Native families and communities, there's a lot of mistrust of the system because, right, the history of a lot of those grandparents who were in those residential care boarding school, and now it's their grandchild that's engaging with the system. And so there would be a natural hesitance to go through licensing process and talk to a social worker because a lot of the historical trauma that's been perpetuated by our systems.
The best thing we could do is if you looked at the ideal circumstance, a lot of tribal organizations know a child's extended family. They know who the aunt is. They know who the uncle is. They know who the grandparent is. So we have put in the law, Amanda and I work together, and we've got it in the law. And every time that law wasn't being followed, we strengthened the law. And every single time that law wasn't being followed, we strengthened the law. But the state is required to do a diligent search to see if there's an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or a family friend who can take this child. So the first option is there's somebody the child knows who will love that child, who that child loves, who will be the foster parent until we figure out whether we can reunify the child with the parent. So that's in our law right now. It was frustrating because repeatedly it wasn't being followed. But if you look at the best example of how this can work is we should have contracting with Alaska Native entities if it's an Alaska Native child and say, look, you're in Bethel. You know who the grandparent is. The caseworker in Anchorage doesn't know. But you know in Bethel, and then all of a sudden the child is placed, you compact with the tribe, identifies the family members, and that's a great solution for a child. It's a loving solution for a child. And they find an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent, and all of a sudden you've relieved a burden on the foster care system. A, you've done the right thing for this child. You've done the right thing for this family. And now you don't have to go find some strange foster family. You limit the number of foster families you need. If
And in
you
that
just,
example you're talking about, potentially moving the kid out of their home to by air. If they can stay in their community, then
yeah, the tradition is to not consult with the tribe, to not consult, to not do the research, to take the kid and you find them in Galena and they're living with a strange family in Anchorage. That's the traditional response. It's wasteful, it's harmful to the child, and it's harmful to the child's cultural identity. Look, it doesn't, whether you're Alaskan Native or you're Filipino American or you're a Pacific Islander, or whatever, or you're Caucasian, to be placed with an uncle or an aunt is so much better than to be shipped 300 miles to be placed with a strange family. And you need fewer foster families if you do this.
and the kids need stability.
And I think the issue of shortage of foster families, it's twofold, right? There's a movement to get children with kin or with relatives sooner, but also knowing that if a child's removed from their home in the middle of the night because of domestic violence or who knows what that may be, it's going to be really hard in that moment to identify family. And so when you have an emergency option of a family that's willing to take in children, like in those immediate circumstances, while the caseworker does what they need to do to identify family, that makes all the difference too. And again, that could be that sort of like just for the weekend or overnight or for a week. But it makes a big difference when we have that everywhere in the state. And so if it's Galena and these children have a place to go for 2 nights, it's figured out where they're going to go next, that could make a huge impact, right? And so that could mean also a family that gets licensed to do foster care and kind of sits and twiddles their thumbs for a bit until something happens pretty immediately and for a short period.
Providing respite care is a wonderful way to dip your toes in. I'll use an example. We did respite care for an infant because the foster mom, so it wasn't like the biological mom, but the foster mom needed to go to a conference in Las Vegas and didn't want to take a heroin addicted infant. So for 3 days, we had this 5-week-old and gave the medicine and everything so that she could have this 3-day break, which was very valuable to her. Like just beyond valuable, that she got 3 nights in a hotel where she could sleep all night. She didn't have to wake up with the alarm to give the medicine to the baby. And we got this 3-day experience, which was difficult, but it's very limited. And so that's a possibility. If you're like thinking this is maybe something I want to do, but I'm not really sure, you could provide a few days of respite care. You know, you go through the training, you get licensed, and then you could just do these tiny little assignments.
Yep. And I will add to, so I think sometimes people sign up with the intent of being a forever family and there are programs for that, but OCS is really not meant to be an adoption agency. Our state has a program specifically, it's called PARCA, where people can get licensed. They can contact the Alaska Center for Resource Families, and they will just wait until a child is legally free for adoption after all efforts have been exhausted to reunify or identify family. But for others who sign up to foster, I think also recognizing it's a temporary, you're standing in for this family to be a support for these children for a period of time. And maybe you become a permanent option, but ideally it's always meant to be temporary.
You had one more thing you wanted to say as a small thing I could do or a big issue that
Oh, I think it's focusing on that recruitment piece for foster families, right? I think it's twofold. Absolutely. Focusing on the workforce first so people can do meaningful social work and make good decisions and try to find relatives and try to find supports for parents and all the things that you need to have in place to support a family involved with the system. But then having that balance of resource families all over the state as temporary or longer term options for children.
And Les, do you have any?
Yeah, the hardest thing I think is when legislators leave and new legislators come in, there's no continuity, which is fine. You don't want lifetime legislators. But Amanda and I have worked to try and educate as many of the new legislators as possible and the new public officials as possible of the law that they weren't around for when it passed, right?
So that we're not reinventing the wheel.
So you're not reinventing the wheel. But it's not. But there are things you could do that are. You would think when you first come into the legislature that any smart legislation would be easy to pass. And now you know that any smart legislation is not easy to pass. There's so many roadblocks. But the easiest thing, and it's required by law also, to do for you would be you wouldn't even have to get a bill passed. You get a budget item inserted into the budget after you convince people it's the right thing to do for some money, $250,000, to do a social media campaign to recruit for foster parents. Because what Amanda and I have learned is in all the volunteer projects we've started, we haven't just done work for government to do. We've started a number of volunteer initiatives that have worked. When people find out there's a need, they respond. Look, it's not easy. It's not the right time for everybody to become a foster parent. I know you were trying to explain to people, look, the barrier is not very high to be a foster parent. But it's often not the right time of somebody's life. If you can do it, please. And if you can't, we understand. But when people hear there's a need for foster families, they respond because Alaskans are generous. People are generous. And so that would be the easiest thing you could do. You wouldn't have to, passing a budget item is way easier than passing a bill that also requires a budget increment. It's a tenth the work. And people are willing to do it. All you have to do is point to the line in the law that says at times of shortage, the state has a duty to recruit foster parents.
And we are at a time of shortage.
Yeah. So it's in the law, and I think most legislators would be happy to do a small budget item to comply with the law. It's been frustrating for Amanda and I to try and explain that to people. And by hook or crook, we found ways to get money to advertise. Like Amanda mentioned, we went to the city one year when the state wasn't willing to do it. And in defense of legislators and the governor, budget time is really hectic. And everybody's asking for something. So this should be asked for early on and explained early on in the budget process.
I will ask for it.
But yeah, we had to go to the city. The city isn't even responsible for foster care. It's half the population lives in Anchorage. And so the city said, yeah, we'll do a social media campaign to recruit foster families. And it works. Yeah.
Amanda Metivier and Les Gara, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for your interest in leadership.
Again, all of the links mentioned in today's episode can be found in the show notes. You can also find the link to Alaska's foster care page. Please, if you have any curiosity at all, check out that page and consider applying. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com.